talk about how Gatsby uses GraphQL. If you've never used Gatsby before and you're wondering what it is, then let me tell you that it's a web compiler. Amongst other things, Gatsby lets you build apps, web apps in React, and lets you use GraphQL to consume data from many different sources, and eventually gives you a bunch of static assets that you can just deploy over to a CDN, right? And the cool thing about Gatsby is that it lets you get data from multiple different sources. So instead of looking at screenshots of how that works, let's actually try it out. So I'm going to create a new Gatsby site. I'm going to call it GraphQL Madrid. Okay. And we're going to use a starter called Gatsby Starter Blog, which is going to set up a site for us very quickly. And let's give NPM a few seconds. Okay, apparently longer than a few seconds. Let's give it another few seconds. And that is still running, I think. Interesting. This should not take so long. So while that spins up and while we get dependencies and stuff cloned, let's talk about let's look at the other slides. So like I said before, Gatsby lets you build apps with React and GraphQL. So in most circles, I like calling Gatsby React with superpowers. You get React, you can do the same things that you can typically do with Create React App, but the superpowers that you have is that you have access to data from multiple sources all over GraphQL. So let's say you have a Markdown file with this content in it. Once our Gatsby site spins up, this is one of the default sort of Markdown content that we have in one of the files. And usually, I mean, writing stuff in Markdown or writing stuff in, say, Graph CMS that we just saw is nice, but having to consume different data sources is typically not very easy. I mean, you're going to be calling different APIs, you're going to be having Webpack loaders to sort of consume this Markdown. So what Gatsby does is that it makes all of your data available over GraphQL. And it does that without you having to do any work there. You can spin up a Gatsby site, have a Markdown file, right? And you will get all the data that you have in that Markdown file over GraphQL. And if this is almost done. It's moving forward. So once this is done, we'll see what that typically looks like. But you know what the interesting thing about this is? It's that you aren't restricted to just Markdown. You can pull data from pretty much anywhere. That could be a Markdown file, that could be JSON files, CSVs, or even CMSs like WordPress and Drupal, Contentful, and really pretty much anything. This list doesn't include Graph CMS, but while Jesse was talking, I checked out the fact that we have a Graph CMS plugin as well, which works, which is really cool. So we'll take a look at how that works in a few seconds. All right, so now that we have this done, let's get into GraphQL Madrid and take a look at what your typical Gatsby site looks like. Now, in this case, you notice that I'm in the wrong directory, so I need to get into GraphQL Madrid and then open that. So let's close this, make this a little bigger. All right, so like we were talking about previously, we have some content in Markdown files, all right? And this is just plain old Markdown, and I want to be able to consume this data. Now, typically what I would do is I would add a Webpack loader that can read these files off of disk and let me consume that data in a specific way, but that can get tough, and that's also specific per data type. With Gatsby, what you can do is, so we don't even need to do any of the stuff that if you start a new project, you can use a starter like we just did. The starter we just used right now includes plugins. In case you're not using a starter, you can go ahead and add two plugins in this case. One is Gatsby Source File System, which lets you get stuff from disk, and then Gatsby Transformer Remark, which lets you sort of consume Markdown. But in our case, we already have these. It came with the starter, so we don't need to do any of that. Let's just take a look at the Gatsby site that's now running. So now that we have this running, let's take a look at GraphQL. So in GraphQL, very quickly, let's try to get data from our Markdown file. If I start typing and say all markdown remark, you'll see that I already have access to a bunch of nodes with IDs. I have some key called front matter, which perhaps is these keys. So let's try to get, say, the title and the date and the description. And I can also go ahead and get the HTML for what this markdown would convert into. If I run command enter and run the query, you'll see that I've now gotten the title, the date, the description, the HTML, right? And for all of them, for 3 different pages. If I go back and edit hello world and say hello Madrid and change the title as well and hit save, and if I run this query again, you'll see that this now says hello Madrid. So the cool thing about how all of this works together is that I didn't have to read my file locally or write any code to be able to consume this. All I had to do was use a GraphQL plugin, a Gatsby plugin that lets me get this data over GraphQL. Now, while we were watching Jesse's talk, we saw him build out this really cool Graph CMS API with records, right? And what I was thinking about was, how easy it would be for me to consume that if I wanted to. So let's go back and get the URL that Jesse has very kindly given us, and let's see if we can consume that. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a plugin. In this case, it's going to be called Gatsby Source. I think the plugin is called Gatsby Source Graph CMS, maybe. Oh no, we just need Gatsby Source GraphQL, right? So we don't have or need a specific plugin for Graph CMS, but we can use the Source GraphQL plugin, which typically lets you source data from any service that has a native GraphQL endpoint. So now that we've added this plugin, let's go ahead and add it to Gatsby config. So now Gatsby config, if you've never used Gatsby, is the config file which lets you set up plugins and give it options, right? So in this case, I'm going to say Gatsby source GraphQL. I think we need some more options, if I remember correctly. I don't remember what those options are. So let's look at documentation. It says that we need a type name, a field name, and a URL. Great. We already have the URL which Jesse gave us. So I'm going to paste that in here. This is Graph CMS. This is the one that he just set up on during his talk. And we're also going to add these other options, which is type name and field name. So now that we've added these, let's go ahead and run Gatsby. Gatsby develop is what you'll use if while you want to sort of run your site in development mode. So now that that's running, let's see if we can now consume the data from Graph CMS. It's sourcing nodes. So sourcing nodes typically means that it's fetching data from all of your sources. This might be taking a little longer than usual because of my internet connection. Okay, now that it's done, let's go back to graphical. Okay, and this time I'm going to hit refresh so that I get the new schema. You'll see that I have something called all GraphQL source, which we didn't have previously. So now that's interesting. Let's take a look at what that is. I reckon one of it will be the one we just added. So we do get one. The type name is GCMS and the field name is GCMS. So that means that the config that we just added worked. Let's try to get data from Graph CMS. So as you see, autocomplete tells me that there's some field called GCMS. Now you notice that this is the same field that I added in config. So this can be anything. But yeah, let's go ahead and query this. Let's see that we now have artists, all with names. We should have producers, and one of them is me. And we should have records as well, all of which will have titles, and I reckon artists with names. All right, so let's go ahead and run this query and see if it works. And it does. We get you-know-who produced by me from a record called Madrid Streets by you-know-who. So now this is the beauty of Gatsby and how it uses GraphQL, right? We just went from using a plain markdown file right? And remember that the markdown data is still in here. I can still go ahead and say all markdown remark and say, give me all the titles of my posts as well. So I can continue to, let's say we're building a record store like Jesse was suggesting. I could continue to have my blog in Markdown and have, the store with Graph CMS. And this is what I think the power of Gatsby is, and this is the superpower that I was previously referring to. You can pull data from literally anywhere. We have hundreds of different source plugins, and like we've just seen, we can consume anything from a Markdown file to a GraphQL endpoint from something like Graph CMS, or even a really old-fashioned CMS like WordPress that doesn't have a GraphQL endpoint, or even a Google Doc or a database like MongoDB. So let's talk about how this works and where it came from, right? If you take a step back, we'll see that there was a time when Gatsby was pre-GraphQL, when we didn't use GraphQL, and data was initially sort of pushed into templates. So you notice that in Gatsby, I've had a source directory which has a folder called templates, and this is just plain old React code. If you write a lot of React code, this will look very familiar. These are all React components, and this is a template for my blog post. And what Gatsby is doing is that it's creating a page for each blog post using this template, right? But initially, before pre-GraphQL, Gatsby still had this notion of templates, but you'd have to push data into templates. Now that looks a lot like how static site generators looked like before Gatsby, where you'd have to, let's say, use Jekyll or Hugo, where you'd push data into templates. Now that can get a little tricky, because when it comes to stuff like Webpack, when it comes to being able to use this markdown file that I have in here and consume its data, if I'm using a Webpack loader to get data from it, that's great and it works. But Webpack is a bundler. It's not a database. It's not something you can query, which means that if I was building a site that didn't use all of these fields, that just used title, or let's say I was rendering a page which just lists my blog posts, which didn't need the entire content, it's very tricky for me to be able to tell Webpack or tell a specific loader to just get that specific data and not get everything. And we've seen why that can be bad on the web. We've seen why, and one of the biggest strengths of GraphQL is that it lets you, fetch just what you need and not over or under fetch. So, those are some of the problems we saw, and this was a couple of years ago. And you also tend to miss the flexibility of building a database-driven site, right? With a database-driven site, you can write complex queries that can do interesting things with your data. I could generate blog posts about each record that comes from, say, Graph CMS in here, and maybe I could take producers and have them as authors on my blog, and maybe render them on like a little widget somewhere. Stuff like that is pretty easy when you have a database and when you can write rich queries, but that kind of stuff gets really hard without a database. That's some of the stuff that Gatsby and GraphQL together allow you to now do. You can query for any data that is available. As you've seen, I just pulled in data from Graph CMS and from Markdown. And the keyword here is pull. You don't have to push data into a template. Instead, you can pull data that a page needs, right? And that's one of sort of the biggest changes that this has sort of made possible. And this happened a while ago. I think Kyle had there you go, 3rd of September 2016. So it's been a couple of years since Gatsby has had GraphQL and have had a data layer that supports GraphQL. And let's talk a little more about what that data layer does. I've spoken about, I've called it a data layer, and we've seen that Gatsby can support many different plugins and many different data sources, but there's a lot of stuff that's going on under the hood. And some of that stuff includes the things I have here on this list. You might have noticed with Jesse's talk that on Graph CMS, he built out an entire model which had, a schema and a sort of a typed data model of the data that he eventually entered. And that's great. It's always nice to have a schema, and because that makes your apps less brittle, and you can sort of use that ahead of time to know what kind of data you're going to fetch. And that's one of the coolest, that's another really cool thing about GraphQL, right? But having a schema is a privilege. You don't always get data sources that come with typed schemas. For example, we had this markdown file right here. Now I could add another key in here and call it, let's say, okay, give me a field name, somebody. I can't think of anything. Perhaps a subtitle that says, "Hello Madrid, it's nice to..." That's really cliched. Let me come up with a better one. What is "Hello Madrid" in Spanish? Is it hola, or is it hola? Carlos, you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah, it's with H. Before you did again.
Before was correct.
Yeah,
is this correct?
You did great. Yeah, your Spanish is good.
All right. All right. Cool. I don't speak Spanish, but I can try. So yeah, so now we have another key in here, right? We call it subtitle, and I can hit refresh and go back and fetch subtitle, and you'll see that it comes out perfectly. I get Hola Madrid, but the thing with this is that I never added subtitle to any schema. This was never added to. These types weren't defined anywhere, and that's what happens with data sources that are not as sophisticated as CMSs like GraphCMS that lets you build a data model, right? But you still need to consume them. So what do you do then? What you do then is that you depend on automatic type inference. And that's one of the first things that Gatsby's done with GraphQL, which I think is, pretty revolutionary. Not a lot of people use GraphQL this way, or rather not a lot of people have used GraphQL this way, since we saw the use of GraphQL outside of Facebook and a couple of places. So yeah, so automatic type inference, and in case that doesn't, in case you're not familiar with what I mean here, what I mean is that what Gatsby is doing under the hood is that it's fetching your data and it's inferring the types that the schema would need. So every time Gatsby goes through all of these markdown files, the plugin that we use to generate that part of the schema, which in this case is Gatsby Transformer Remark. Remark is a markdown compiler, and this is a plugin that can understand what markdown is and then give you HTML from it. All right. So Remark in this case is reading through this markdown file and saying that, hey, I see a couple of fields in front matter, and one of them is description. So that means that there might be a key called description in my data, right? So under the hood, Gatsby is letting its plugins infer a lot of this schema, and it's doing it automatically. And this is super powerful because, like I said before, with source plugins or with data sources that don't come with models, this is super useful. Now, what else do? We also do a bunch of other cool things, like generating collections. Now, in the same example of Markdown, you saw that we have 3 different blog posts, and they are in a directory called blog, right? And in my config, I told Gatsby source file system, which reads files from disk, that I want a collection called blog. And you'll see that it's gone ahead and already created this, this collection here. I think that's supposed to be one called all blog posts, but I might be getting that wrong. Yes, I probably am getting that wrong. I think it'll likely be all site page, but under a collection called blog. But anyway, the markdown, the sort of transformed markdown is what we're interested in. And you see that there is a collection for these pages. And this collection is useful because I can now use this collection to be able to sort of render a list of these different blog posts, right? This didn't sort of exist right off the bat. The plugin sort of didn't have a way to tell Gatsby that it would like there to be a GraphQL collection. That's just something Gatsby's done out of the box, where it's seen that there are multiple different nodes that are of the type markdown, and maybe maybe we can collect them and give you a collection out of it. So that's also happening automatically. Let's talk about filters and sort of MongoDB like querying. You can write queries that do more than just. You can write GraphQL queries that do more than just fetch all of these. For instance, I can say I want to filter. Let's say I want to filter and get blog posts by me. So I'm going to say go to front matter and go to, I think, what is it, author? Oh wait, we don't have an author, do we? Okay, so we don't have an author. Let's add one. Let's add author for this post is me, and then I'm going to go to the other post and make the author of this post. Wow, I cannot spell. I'm going to make the author of this post Carlos, and then I'm going to make the author of this post Jesse. All right, and now you'll see that if I remove all of this filter stuff, right, then I will straight up get, oh wow, that breaks because expected name found closing bracket. Oh, that's because of, right. Yeah, okay. It should work. There you go. Now if I look for an author, I'll have to hit refresh because the schema has changed. So now that if I look for the author, there you go. You see that I get a couple of author names. If I want to just get posts by me, I can go back and say, hey, filter by the author field and make sure that you only give me ones that are equal to my name, right? I think this needs to be, there you go. Yeah. And if I hit enter now, you'll see that I only get blog posts that are written by me, right? So this kind of querying is typically has to be written by hand, and that's a lot of work, right? Gatsby gives this to you out of the box. Gatsby is generating, as you can see, a lot of these types in Explorer and well in Docs as well. If you were to look through all of the types it generates, you'll see that Gatsby generates types and collections, and it also generates these smart filters. It also lets you do, more than filtering. Like say if you want to sort by, let's say we want to sort by in say ascending order, and we want to do that for the front matter title. All right, I'm going to remove the author filter so that I can get more than one blog post. There you go. And now we'll see if this comes sorted. It does. Hello Madrid comes before my second post, and then New Beginnings comes, right? So we've now also sorted this collection by this field. A lot of this stuff that we've just seen, a lot of this rich querying functionality has sort of been generated on the fly for you, and Gatsby's done that under the hood. It also does interesting things like relationships and mappings. You can tell Gatsby that instead of, say, author coming as just a string in this file, I can go back and create a different file, like, say, authors.json, and put authors in there. Like I previously said, I can also go back and make a relationship mapping between data coming in from, say, Graph CMS, like producers, and make them authors for the blog post, for the blog on my record label store, right? So yeah, let's talk about what the limitations are of this aspect. We've seen the things that it allows you to do, and we've seen the good parts, but there are some limitations, and some things can get tricky. And if you've used Gatsby in the past, if you've used Gatsby in production, you've probably seen these. You probably saw them earlier, and you probably also have hit them in your sites, because these are fairly common problems, right? And let's talk about the first one. The first one is that what if there isn't any data? In a lot of cases, this inference that we just spoke about relies on the existence of example data, right? For Gatsby to be able to figure out that a markdown type will have a key called front matter, which in turn has author, it needs to have an example sort of data point to be able to get that. And the reason that's brittle is that if you don't have any data, you don't have any types, right? And that can be problematic. Let's say I was building a site with a blog, right? And let's say I deleted all of my blog posts. Let's say I deleted all of these markdown files. In fact, let's go and try that right now. If we go back and delete all of these, so I'm gonna delete the third one. Okay, I think now we're empty, right? There you go. Now we're empty. We deleted the files and not the folders. So now I've deleted everything. Okay, there's one folder left. I guess I could delete that as well. Okay, it's gone. So now blog is an empty folder. If I go back and run the same query again, and I'm going to remove the graph CMS query for a second, you'll see that this fails because it says expected type markdown remark fields enum found something else, right? And this is a GraphQL error. And the reason this is a GraphQL error is because GraphQL validation is failing because this schema, I mean, these types don't exist right now. And this is the brittleness that I was referring to when I said that if you don't have any data, you won't have types, and that can be brittle. And sometimes a shape is just known in advance, right? Now, for instance, with Graph CMS, when Jesse made the entire sort of model and put in this data, you already know ahead of time that there's going to be a key called artists, and there's going to be, a field called name in it, and that name is going to be a type of, there you go, GCMS artist. You already know a lot of this data, right? So it seems a little wasteful to not be able to use that in a smart way and to have Gatsby still infer things. And also you have cases where your schema can change as a result of your data. As you saw, we added a key called author, and that resulted in the schema changing, right? And that can also be brittle because you could have sites that depend on a certain schema that would break because of the change in it, right? That could happen like without anyone even noticing. And this is why we came to a conclusion that, okay, so when I made these slides, this was supposed to be a nice joke. I don't even remember what the joke was there. So I'm just going to pause at this slide for a second, let you appreciate the beautiful, the image. And I'll move on to what was the solution eventually to these brittle problems that we saw. We added a mechanism in Gatsby called Schema Customization. And this happened somewhere, I think, mid last year. And what this does is that it finally lets Gatsby plugins and consumers define schemas ahead of time instead of relying on inference. So in this case, as you can see in this example code, we have a function called create types, which you can pass, SDL to and say that, hey, I want to create a type called author.json, make it a node, and make it implement a node. A node in this case is just an internal Gatsby type. And I can say that there are two fields called name and birthday, and I can create those types. And the cool thing about this is that even if there's no data, I still won't get GraphQL validation errors. My queries will still run. They might, just return null or an empty array, but at least they won't break validation, right? And in some cases, you want to do a mix of both. You want to be able to not infer some things, but you want to be able to infer other parts. Let's say you have and this is true today for Gatsby and a lot of its plugins. Let's say you have older plugins that rely on inference, and you have newer versions of the plugins that, build their own types. To be able to transition between the two iteratively, you want to be able to have an API that lets you get the best of both worlds, right? So we have these directives, including don't infer and infer, and we can tell on a per type basis to Gatsby that, hey, go ahead and infer these fields or don't infer any fields on this type, right? And a lot of these APIs were available in Gatsby 2.2. So if you've updated Gatsby recently in the past 6 or 8 months, you've probably used something above Gatsby 2.2. We're currently, I think, on 2.20. And huge hat tip to Mikhail on our team and Stefan as well for all of their work on this. These are the APIs. If you want to, play with this more, please feel free to, get Gatsby, install it, create a site, check out its docs. And with that, we're doing a bunch of things moving forward as well with GraphQL. And the idea is to have many more built-in resolvers. One of them that we've been planning on implementing for a while is what we call the defer directive. And With the defer directive, the idea is that you can have parts of your data from GraphQL that aren't necessarily needed when the page is first hit. You might be able to say have pagination that on scroll keeps loading more data. In a lot of those cases, you want to be able to tell Gatsby that, hey, when you run the runtime, get some of this data later. So a lot of these things, in a lot of these cases, GraphQL directives come in handy, on a per field or a per type basis. And add defer is one that we've been working on and one that we intend to ship soon. You should be able to use this for pagination. We're also building in more directives to share resolvers between types. Right now I think we've shipped a couple after that. We have one called file by path, for example, where if you want to be able to just get a file from a path, you don't have to write the resolver yourself. You can just add a file by path directive, and Gatsby will use some of its default resolvers to do this for you. So you remember when I initially said that Gatsby is React with superpowers? GraphQL is the superpower. GraphQL allows us to be able to fetch data and source it from many different sources, as we've seen as part of this. It really is, honestly, a big part of what Gatsby lets you do. And we love GraphQL. And that's it.